The act of quoting the Constitution doesn't make you someone who understands the law, just like wearing a stethoscope doesn't make someone a doctor. That sentence, spoken by none other than Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh in the hallowed halls of Harvard Law School, froze the entire room for half a second. The light from the cameras reflected off the thick glass panels of Langdell Hall, where nearly 200 students, professors, judges, and journalists were attending a forum originally promoted as a civil academic exchange. But within less than 2 minutes, things had already spun far beyond expectations. The topic that day was the Constitution and moral authority, a seemingly dry subject that quickly turned into an unspoken battleground between two opposing powers. Stage left, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, an anchor of the Supreme Court, calm in demeanor but always knowing when to draw his sword. Stage right, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, representative from Texas, lawyer, activist, and once mockingly dubbed a TikTok congresswoman by right-wing media. Between them was more than a wooden table. There lay an entire foundation of power now being questioned. Cameras panned across the faces, some tense, some smirking, some waiting for something to break. And within the first 3 minutes, it seemed the battle had already been decided. A sneer, a silence, and a pocket constitution that hadn't yet been opened. What would drive a Supreme Court justice to use mockery on camera? And how did he become the one left with no final word? Where in America are you watching from? Leave a comment. Who do you think truly understood the Constitution that day? And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the moments when truth speaks, even when the mic isn't pointed at it. The forum, titled The Constitution and Moral Authority, was held at Langdell Hall of Harvard Law School, a venue that had once welcomed the most prominent figures in the U.S. legal system. Seats were filled early. In the front row sat distinguished professors. Beside them were representatives from the American Bar Association, former federal prosecutors, and a few current judges. Behind them were final-year law students, the very faces that might soon enter the nation's judiciary. The atmosphere was marked by both solemnity and expectation. It was a rare event where a sitting Supreme Court justice and a current congresswoman would share the same stage to speak on the same topic, the Constitution and the ethics of power. Moderating the program was Professor Linda Walsh, Chair of Constitutional Law. She opened by introducing each speaker. Justice Brett Kavanaugh was introduced first. As his name was announced, the entire hall erupted in applause. Some even stood up. Known for presiding over landmark cases involving executive power, Kavanaugh was widely seen as a symbol of the Supreme Court's role in safeguarding the separation of powers. He walked to the stage amid steady clapping, nodding politely, composed and reserved, speaking no more than necessary. Next was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, representing the House of Representatives from Texas. When Professor Walsh mentioned that Congresswoman Jasmine co-authored several bills on judicial oversight reform, the applause was noticeably lighter. A few students at the back murmured, "Isn't that the TikTok congresswoman?" "Yeah, she's the one who always claps back at those old guys in Congress." Jasmine stepped up. She showed no sign of being bothered. She simply nodded slightly to the audience and sat down, placing a small pocket constitution on her lap. As the dialogue began, the tone remained civil. Kavanaugh spoke first. He was slow, clear, and used precise academic language. His opening line was, "Every constitutional crisis in American history began when one branch of power overstepped its originally intended role." This earned moderate applause. He continued, citing a series of legal precedents, from Marbury versus Madison to Dobbs versus Jackson. He emphasized the principle of checks and balances, tactfully linking it to current efforts in Congress to regulate the courts through new legislation. Kavanaugh paused for a few seconds and scanned the room. Then he said, "Moral decay, if it exists, should not be defined by Congress, because Congress was never designed to be neutral." This time, the applause was stronger. A few professors nodded. Some students even murmured, "So true." The mood began to tilt in Kavanaugh's favor. Jasmine had yet to speak. The moderator, Professor Walsh, then posed a question to both guests. "In your view, what constitutional limits exist on Congress when it seeks to regulate the Supreme Court? The room quieted. It was a difficult question, especially with two branches of government now facing each other on the same stage. Kavanaugh seized the moment. He leaned slightly back in his chair, gave a faint smile and said, "I think some of our legislators, with all due respect, should take time to revisit the clause on separation of powers in the Constitution. That separation is not ornamental. It exists to shield the republic from well-meaning ignorance." The room went still for half a second. Then a few chuckles rose from the student section. Kavanaugh's expression remained composed, but this time his gaze was unmistakably directed toward Jasmine. Not harsh, not accusatory, just a gentle look, yet one that carried a clear message. "I see you, and you should know who you're speaking to." Jasmine didn't respond. She simply pressed her lips together and remained still. The small Constitution lay across her lap, still unopened. The atmosphere inside Langdale Hall began to shift, slowly and subtly, like the temperature dropping, degree by degree. After Kavanaugh's pointed remark, no one offered a rebuttal. All eyes in the room remained fixed on him, not because he spoke loudly, but because he spoke at exactly the right moment. The moderator, Professor Walsh, offered a courteous smile before moving on to the next topic. "Thank you, Justice Kavanaugh. Now let's analyze some recent legislative proposals related to regulating conflicts of interest within the Supreme Court." On the screen behind the stage, a slide appeared. The first line read clearly, "Judicial Accountability and Ethics Reform Act, co-sponsored by Repression Jasmine Crockett." Kavanaugh glanced at the screen, his hand still resting loosely on his lap. He didn't respond immediately, but waited a beat. Then in a slow, razor-sharp tone, he said, "I've read this bill. I understand the good intentions behind it. But if we begin building judicial ethics through legislation instead of jurisprudence, can we still claim to uphold the independence that underpins the principle of separation of powers?" He paused. No one interrupted. This bill, if enacted, would set a precedent allowing Congress, a political body, to intrude on the internal principles of the judiciary. And in doing so, we open the door for politics to govern the act of judgment itself. Several students scrambled to take notes. A few heads nodded. There were hushed whispers. "Makes sense." Kavanaugh continued, this time with sharper academic language. "According to rulings in United States versus Nixon Rosero and Plout versus Spendthrift Farm Wayman again, the Supreme Court has repeatedly reaffirmed that no branch, not even Congress, may take actions that alter the nature of judicial decisions or the internal principles of the judicial branch." He looked up and cast a glance toward Jasmine. "I respect anyone who walks into this room carrying a pocket constitution. But quoting a clause doesn't mean you understand how that clause has been applied and defended throughout American legal history." Then, a soft chuckle rose from a corner of the hall. Not loud, but enough to shift the mood. "Some here may quote the Constitution," Kavanaugh continued, "but that doesn't mean they understand it like those who've ruled from the Supreme Court bench." Scattered applause followed. Not rousing, but approving. Some students exchanged quiet remarks. A few looked at Jasmine, not mockingly, but with a touch of concern. Jasmine remained seated, her expression unchanged, but those sitting nearby could see her left hand tightening around her pen, as if to keep herself from reacting. The moderator looked her way, a polite gesture, but also a nudge that placed her in a position where a response was expected. "Congresswoman Crockett, would you care to respond to Justice Kavanaugh's argument?" Jasmine picked up the microphone. The stage lights angled across her face, casting a slender shadow along her jawline. She looked straight ahead, not at Kavanaugh nor the moderator. Her voice was calm. "I think that's an interesting perspective." She paused. The whole hall waited for more, but nothing followed. "I'll let the law students here decide for themselves whether that argument holds," she added, "and consider whether the Constitution was written to protect institutions or to protect the people from institutions." She set the microphone down, gave a slight nod to the moderator, then fell silent. The moderator offered a courteous thank you, but the shift in the room was now unmistakable. Jasmine had just let a moment slip by. The way the audience perceived her began to change. Expectation gave way to doubt. A female student in the front row leaned over and whispered to a friend, "She should have pushed back harder." A male student behind her muttered, "Thought she'd be sharper than that." Kavanaugh said nothing more. He didn't need to. Jasmine's silence had completed the work for him. The moderator resumed steering the discussion, moving to the third segment, the constitutional limits of internal oversight on the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh was invited to speak first once again. This time, he didn't quote precedent. He spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had won many unseen battles. Power in a republic does not lie in volume. It lies in standards, and standards are not created by political slogans. He paused, then concluded, standards are created by the court. That final sentence landed like a period struck at the very center of Jasmine's presence. And this time the applause grew louder. Some students now looked at her with a mix of anticipation and disappointment. She remained seated, back straight, hands on her lap. But it was clear the momentum had swung entirely toward Kavanaugh. No rebuttal, no smile. She hadn't fought back, but she hadn't surrendered either. And that was exactly the moment when the tension reached its peak. Time moved slowly inside Langdell Hall. The sound of notebook pages turning grew faint. Even the slightest noise, the soft tap of a pen against the table, felt amplified as if in a sealed room. From her seat, Jasmine Crockett hadn't spoken another word since her earlier line. That's an interesting perspective. Other panelists took their turns. A scholar from Yale offered a view on the evolving nature of judicial independence. A Harvard professor responded gently, aiming for balance. But most eyes in the room continued to glance toward Jasmine, waiting to see whether she would respond or quietly step back. She didn't raise her hand, didn't adjust her mic, didn't lean back like the others to appear at ease. She remained silent. Until the moderator, Professor Walsh, turned to her, voice polite but loaded with implication. Congresswoman Crockett, if you'd like to share your thoughts on congressional authority over the Supreme Court, this would be the right time. Jasmine didn't rush. She didn't open a slide, didn't look at any prepared notes. She simply reached into the pocket of her blazer and took out a slim, worn, blue-covered booklet. A pocket constitution, the small printed version of the U.S. Constitution. She opened to a page with a folded corner, no preamble, no setup, just her voice, steady and clear. Congress shall have power to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court, and to make exceptions, and under such regulations as the Congress shall make, to the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. She closed the booklet. The room fell instantly silent, not from confusion, but from surprise. A male student in the middle row muttered, "Wait, is that in there?" Some glanced down at their phones, others flipped through their books. A few straightened in their seats, not in opposition, but as if quietly challenged. Jasmine didn't smile. She simply lifted her eyes and looked directly at Kavanaugh, not confrontational, not defensive. Her voice remained calm. The Constitution wasn't written to serve anyone's pride. A beat. It was written to test the power held by all of us. With that, she gently placed the pocket Constitution back on the table. No one clapped, but no one countered either. Those who had applauded Kavanaugh just minutes earlier kept their hands on their laps, their eyes shifting. A female student looked at her friend, eyes slightly wide. A professor paused mid-note, pen hovering. Kavanaugh didn't respond. He looked directly at Jasmine for a few seconds. His expression didn't change, but his right hand, resting on his knee, tightened slightly. No one in the room had expected that after 90 minutes of legal debate, the most significant shift wouldn't come from lengthy argument, but from a single line of citation. Jasmine didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. No further explanation. No need to assert that she was right. And that precisely was what made the moment feel different. In the front row, a seasoned Harvard professor, a former federal judicial clerk, gave a subtle nod. He said nothing, but a student noticed, and that gesture rippled quietly, a silent signal. The argument could not be dismissed. A final year student flipped back through a textbook. Another opened a laptop, searching for the clause she had read aloud. On social media, nothing had surfaced yet, but inside the hall, the balance had already begun to shift. No uproar, no theatrics. Just a quiet reversal from someone who, only minutes earlier, had seemed to hold the least weight on stage. And precisely because no one expected it, when it happened, no one could quite react in time. A A few seconds after Jasmine closed her pocket constitution, a strange stillness settled over Langdell Hall. No one asked for a break. No one tried to change the topic. Eyes darted quietly across the room, searching, it seemed, for someone who might speak first. Kavanaugh remained still, shoulders unmoving, eyes forward. His face was unreadable, not angry, not pleased. It was the look of someone long familiar with debate, but not accustomed to unpredictability. In the third row, a hand went up. Professor Walsh, the moderator, looked slightly surprised, then gave a nod. "Please." A final-year student stepped out of his seat. He wore a white shirt, his dark curls gently tousled, and thin black-framed glasses. His voice was steady, not shaking, but it carried the weight of something long held back. "My name is Daniel Ruiz, final-year student majoring in criminal law and sociology." The entire room turned toward him. Students shifted in their chairs. Faculty looked up from their notes. He held no papers, no laptop, just stood there, hands clasped at his waist, back straight, eyes fixed on the stage. "I hadn't planned on speaking today, but what just happened made it impossible for me to stay seated." He looked toward Jasmine, then toward Kavanaugh. "My father was a former inmate. He was wrongfully convicted in 2002 of armed robbery. No physical evidence, just a mistaken eyewitness account. It took nearly 10 years to prove his innocence." No one interrupted. "When I was in 6th grade, I asked my mother, 'Why do courts make mistakes?' And she said, 'Because justice isn't only in the hands of people wearing black robes. Sometimes justice comes from those who dare to ask questions.'" Daniel paused for a moment. He took a breath, then continued. "I used to think legal understanding came from authority, from titles. I admired the Supreme Court growing up. I still respect it. But today, for the first time, I witnessed something else. Knowledge can also come from a congresswoman. Someone dismissed, mocked, labeled as loud. Someone who doesn't need a strong mic or applause. Just a single line from the Constitution, and the courage to stay silent at the right moment." He turned to Jasmine. "Congresswoman Crockett, I don't know if you meant to create this moment, but I need to thank you because you just showed me that understanding the Constitution doesn't require a robe. It just requires believing that we all have the right to read it." In the room, a few people nodded. One female student began to cry, but stopped when no one followed. The stillness remains deep, but the emotion underneath has shifted. Daniel looked back toward the stage. His voice softened, but stayed firm. "I never thought I'd say this in front of a Supreme Court justice, but today I believe this. Knowledge doesn't have to come from power. It can come from the disregarded, if that person stands strong enough not to raise their voice." Kavanaugh offered no response. He stared at Daniel for a long moment. No nod, no shake of the head, just silence. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't lift the mic. She hadn't shifted her posture once throughout Daniel's entire speech. She didn't need to. The room stayed silent for nearly 10 seconds after Daniel finished. Not because no one knew what to do, but because no one wanted to be the one to break that moment. Professor Walsh glanced toward the event staff, then finally spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Ruiz. That was a courageous contribution, and a reminder that all of us, whether professors, students, or judges, must reflect." A professor in the front row gently placed his hand over his heart. Another student bowed his head. Someone opened their own pocket constitution, this time not as a souvenir, but as something newly alive. The atmosphere in the room had changed. Not everyone agreed with Jasmine, but from that moment on, no one dared to underestimate her. 3 hours after the Harvard Law School forum, a 3-minute, 47-second video began circulating on Twitter with a simple caption. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett reads one sentence. The room goes silent. Within 24 hours, the clip had garnered over 2.4 million views. The hashtag had Crockett Clause, a reference to the constitutional line Jasmine had read aloud in front of Justice Kavanaugh, quickly surged into the top 5 national trending topics. It started with law students, then spread to legislative reporters, and soon reached late-night political commentators. Many people who had never heard of Jasmine Crockett found themselves Googling, "Congress shall have the power, regulate the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court." On Reddit, A thread with the over 700 comments dissected not only Jasmine's exact words, but every nuance of Kavanaugh's expression when faced with them. Mainstream media responded cautiously at first. CNN included a brief segment in its evening broadcast, calling it an unexpected exchange that shifted the mood in a typically dry legal forum. MSNBC devoted a full analysis piece, inviting two Harvard Law alumni, one of whom said, "I once worked as a research assistant for a federal judge. I know the look of someone who's run out of arguments." I saw that look yesterday, and it wasn't on Congresswoman Crockett. The Atlantic published a feature titled, "When Silence Rewrites Power, Examining Jasmine's Simple Act of Closing Her Pocket Constitution as More Powerful Than 1,000 Hours of Academic Debate." In academic circles, the ripple effect moved faster than expected. Just a day later, a veteran Harvard professor, once a clerk for the Supreme Court, posted on social media, "Today, I was taught by someone once dismissed as uninformed. The good news is I'm still capable of learning. The troubling part is not everyone is willing to learn from someone like her." His post was shared over 18,000 times in less than 12 hours. Harvard's Public Law Society quickly organized an emergency discussion titled, "Redefining Intellectual Authority in Law" is described as, "Has intellectual credibility moved beyond titles and toward those whose experiences have long been ignored?" The RSVP list filled up within 30 minutes. Across other universities, courses covering the separation of powers began adding Jasmine Crockett's name to lecture slides. A second-year student at Stanford Law wrote on the internal forum, "I used to think lawmakers were all talk, but now I see some people read the Constitution not to flaunt it, but to remind others it still applies." But perhaps the most striking reaction came from those outside the legal world. Hundreds of emails, messages, and handwritten letters poured into Jasmine Crockett's office from high school students and young people of color. Some notes were a single sentence, "Thank you for not needing a robe to be heard." One handwritten letter from a high school girl in Mississippi was pinned to the office bulletin board. "I used to think changing society meant speaking loudly, but now I know sometimes the right silence carries further than any shout." Meanwhile, Brett Kavanaugh remained absent from public comment. A Politico reporter reached out to his office for an interview or a response to the Harvard event. The official reply, "We do not comment on academic discussions that do not serve a legal function." No rebuttal, no clarification, no acknowledgement. Commentators noted that the silence was a response in itself. On Capitol Hill, several lawmakers began referencing the clip. A Democratic senator shared the video with the caption, "Maybe we need more people reading the Constitution," without a microphone. Some progressive members even adopted the hashtag Crockett clause to highlight legislative authority in ongoing debates about judicial reform. On TikTok and Instagram, Reels, dubbed versions of Jasmine's reading appeared, layered over cinematic music. Political satire accounts reused the clip to counter past statements by conservative justices. A high school teacher in Chicago posted, "I played this for my American government class," one student whispered. "I didn't think the Constitution could make people go silent like that. And I thought that's a good place to begin." No one knows yet whether that moment will change policy. But it's clear it has already changed how people view who has the right to speak and who deserves to be heard. Not because Jasmine shouted, not because she won an argument, but because she reminded everyone, truth doesn't need a microphone if the one speaking it dares to stand still when others look away. 1 week later, the early morning air in New York City carried a thin veil of mist that settled over the stone steps outside NYU School of Law. Students quietly entered the main building. No cameras, no reporters, no hashtags. No one spoke loudly. Backpacks brushed past each other, eyes lowered to the floor. Today's class belonged to a rarely open seminar, Constitution and Power, reserved for final year students who had passed 2 rounds of confidential selection. The guest lecturer's name had not been publicly disclosed. Room B217, on the east wing of the building, appeared unremarkable. The whiteboard was blank, no slides on the projector, no academic title, no university crest. Only a single line, white text on a muted gray background. "If truth had no robe, would you still call it justice?" No one spoke. Jasmine Crockett entered at 9:01. No name tag, no assistant, no film crew. She wore a white shirt, black trousers, and carried an old pocket Constitution and a capless pen. She didn't walk to the podium. She simply pulled out a chair and sat among the students, forming a quiet semicircle. "I didn't come here to speak. I came to think together." The silence held. A student, female, soft curls, second row, raised her hand. Her voice wasn't loud but clear. "Do you feel triumphant about what happened at Harvard last week?" Jasmine looked up. Her eyes held no surprise, just a quiet understanding. She smiled gently. "No." She turned the pocket Constitution slowly on the table, then continued. "I didn't need to win a debate. I didn't need applause. I just hope that next time, if someone finds themselves in a room like this, and they feel they're not expected to speak, they'll still have the courage to ask anyway." The class remained silent. No typing, no polite nods. Just silence, genuine silence. For a moment, it felt as if people were listening not with their ears, but with something deeper, something more aware. Jasmine didn't lecture. She didn't recount what happened at Harvard. She didn't mention Brett Kavanaugh. She never brought up the video now spreading online. She said only one more thing. Justice doesn't have to come from above. Sometimes, it comes from the smallest question, asked by the person least believed. The session ended exactly on time, not early, not late. Students gathered their things and left quietly. No photos. No one rushed out first. Some passed by and gave a nod. Others said nothing, just looked at her one more time, then walked away. Jasmine remained for a few minutes longer. Light from the window cast across the table, highlighting the worn edges of her pocket Constitution. She stood to leave. Then she saw it, a small piece of paper folded neatly in thirds, placed in the center of the table. No name, no signature. Just a single line, handwritten at a gentle slant. "You didn't shout, but you made me hear you more clearly than anyone who ever did." Jasmine took the paper, folded it once more, and slipped it into her pocket. She didn't smile. She just nodded slightly, as if to return a silent thank you to someone she would never know. She walked out of the room, never looked back. Do you still believe in justice? If the one delivering it doesn't stand on a high bench, doesn't wear a robe, and isn't handed a microphone? Where in America are you watching from? Are you a law student, a teacher, or simply someone who's ever been overlooked? Leave a comment. Have you ever heard the truth from a place no one expected? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where silence sometimes echoes louder than any shout.